When I was finishing up the 6th grade, my parents were struggling with keeping me in the public school in our hometown. They were both public school teachers themselves, but in the next town over. But when a friend's daughter graduated as the valedictorian of her class in our town, and then got questions from college admissions about whether that honor really meant anything because her graduating class was so very small, because it was a very small town, they decided that I needed to go elsewhere for the rest of my education. A number of kids in my 6th grade class went off to private school. We weren't wealthy, so some of those schools were not options. But the fact that transferring me to the public school system where they taught would also cost money because we did not live in that town, they had to weigh options. With about 500 kids in each class, their school avoided the issue of the town's size, even though it lacked the prestige of some of the private options. But my parents were also aware, as the 60s were giving way to the early 70s, that the large public school where they taught had its issues, especially as the drug culture gained steam. Private schools, especially a private religious school, would have a stricter culture, which was especially important to my father. I really didn't have any say in the matter, as 10 going on 11. But I was privy to some of the discussions. And the thing that hit me between the eyeballs was when my mother said to my father, "Well, if you take all the light out of the public school, you can hardly complain that it's dark." That argument won the day, and off to public school in the next town over I went. But I went having heard that conversation. And so I went with what I felt like was a mandate from my mother to shine whatever light I had into whatever dark places awaited in the big world of 7th grade in a new school in a new town. I also went with the awareness that the light she didn't want taken out of the public school wasn't some set of policies and practices. She wasn't expecting me to stand in the hallways and hand out Christian tracts or convert my friends or protest removing prayers from the school day. The light she meant was me at barely 11 years old. She was saying that just me being myself was the light, and that somehow it would be impossible for the school to be totally dark if I simply went there. That is an amazing and powerful gift to give a child. I have never forgotten her words and have carried them with me ever since. When I got to college, I decided I wanted to have a motto for my life, because of course I did, and that it should be about being that light. Since most mottos I was familiar with were in Latin, I summoned my high school Latin and adopted una lux sola tenebras dispellit. It means just one light can dispel the dark. You may have seen it, sometimes it's in my signature on emails, sometimes it's been on my website. That phrase doesn't mean that the light from any one person can dispel all that is dark in the world. It's simply a reminder to both myself and others that darkness is not a thing. It's the absence of a thing. It's the absence of light. So wherever we bring light, darkness can't exist in that same space. If I go into a cave with a flashlight, even total darkness underground can't make my flashlight suddenly go out. Wherever I move with that flashlight, there is light, even if it's still darkness all the way around. The darkness itself, just by virtue of being dark, can't put out the light. In Genesis 1, God didn't create the dark. The dark was already there. God created light where before there was only darkness. God couldn't create dark because dark isn't a thing that can be created. It's the absence of light. You can't make dark. You can only extinguish light. The metaphors of darkness and light are woven throughout the Bible, from that very first paragraph to the very end. Light is created on day one in Genesis, and in the last chapter of the last book of the Bible, we read that in the New Jerusalem, quote, "There will be no more night. They need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever." With all that said, while we exist on this earth, from the first day of creation onward, dark is both good and necessary. If having dark in the world was bad, God would have wiped it out entirely there on day one. But that's not what happened. God created light, separated the light from the dark. The darkness God named night, and the balance of the light, which he called day, and the dark of night, that balance was part of the goodness of the earth that God created. As human beings learn to harness fire and create additional sources of light, a lot of good was done. If you're going to live in a cave, as many still did in the Judean mountains of Jesus' day, you can't do much inside without a lamp, even if it's broad daylight outside. In the daytime, I have lights on in my office so that I can see because I'm inside. But as we humans have innovated enough that light can flood not just a room, but entire cities and regions, we have upset God's intended balance and are paying the price. To begin with, we ensured that people could be forced to work round the clock. The day is literally never done. And abuse of workers, both human and animal, followed immediately. But even if we're not working, artificial light has upset our waking and sleep cycles, which impacts our health in myriad ways. In an article on light pollution, National Geographic reports that more than 80% of the world's population and 99% of Americans and Europeans live under, quote, sky glow. I quote from that article, "Increased amounts of light at night lowers melatonin production, which results in sleep deprivation, fatigue, headaches, stress, anxiety, and other health problems, including," they add, "cancer." And that's just us. It's wrecking wildlife, disrupting migration patterns and habitat formation. To quote that article again, "Because of light pollution, sea turtles and birds guided by moonlight during migration get confused, lose their way, and often die. Large numbers of insects, a primary food source for birds and other animals, are drawn to artificial lights. They die instantly. Artificial light from passing ships and harbors is also wrecking marine ecosystems." On day 4 of creation in Genesis 1, God did provide natural light for the nighttime hours, giving us the beautiful moon and stars, the lesser lights, as Genesis calls them. And all of creation used those lesser lights to navigate days and seasons. Creatures in earth, sea, and sky evolved to know exactly how to get from here to there, even across thousands of miles, by using the moon and the stars as guides. As we insist on more and more light in more and more places around the clock, we have taken a wrecking ball to all of that. And get this, just this year, already in 2025, the World Monuments Fund, a preservation organization that draws attention to historic sites around the world, has named the moon as a threatened historic site. Let that sink in. The moon is now a threatened historic site because we are littering it with space junk, and various nations keep flying up there and sticking a flag in it and say it's ours. Because of course we do. Now, on the flip side, we can't just live in the dark. Sunlight has an amazing array of health benefits for humans, as well as plants and animals. Plants spent billions of years turning sunlight into oxygen through photosynthesis to make this planet suitable for animal and human life. And here we come with our chainsaws to thank them for their trouble. As it turns out, light, like salt, is complicated. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world, Jesus says. We haven't handled either responsibility all that well. As a reminder where those statements by Jesus sit, Matthew 5 is the first public teaching of Jesus recorded in the Gospels, beginning with 4 chapters that have come to be known as the Sermon on the Mount. The first 12 verses of Matthew 5 are the ones we call the Beatitudes, the ones describing the rather counterintuitive set of people who are blessed by God. The poor in spirit, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, and so on. Then in verse 13, the very next verse, Jesus continues by telling that same crowd that they are the salt of the earth, and warning that salt can lose its flavor, which we explored last week. The verses from this morning are the very next thing. You are the light of the world. Jesus elaborates on this declaration a bit too, but this time the warning is different. Jesus doesn't say, take care that your light doesn't go out. Maybe he would have said that to a different crowd. I think maybe he did in the parable of the wise and foolish maidens. But to this particular crowd, to the blessed ones, to the poor, the hungry, the meek, the merciful, the persecuted, Jesus sees their light already shining. The warning is to not be afraid to show it, not to hide their light. While being salt was primarily about preserving, light is about giving. It's about sharing. To put their light on a lampstand, and it gives light to all of the house. And the purpose of that, for those who possess the qualities that he has just called blessed, is, quote, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Now, wait a minute, you might rightfully say. I thought we were supposed to, not let our right hand know what our left hand was doing, and when we pray to go into our closet and shut the door and not let anybody see that. Can he make up his mind, please? All of that is also in the Sermon on the Mount, starting at the beginning of chapter 6, the very next chapter. I think both things can be true. The difference I see is that the things Jesus just praised in the Beatitudes are attitudes of the heart that don't carry with them any chance of earning praise for oneself. We saw in a very public way with Bishop Buddy at the National Cathedral what happens when someone calls for mercy. We see what happens when people call for justice and righteousness and peace. It got Jesus, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. and others killed. The attributes God blesses in the Beatitudes are not things that human society writ large praises. And many people hide their lights under baskets for that very reason. But the things that might earn praise and status in society, giving alms, showy public prayers, those are the things that Jesus says, you know what, how about doing that in private? The qualities that God values does not bring the qualities that God values and the world does not bring glory to God, because Lord only knows people aren't doing that for their own enrichment. They are sharing the light with the downtrodden who need it, often at great cost to themselves. Now, taking all that back to the first chapter of Genesis, God created light, but also in two kinds. Moving down a little bit to day 4, in Genesis 1:14 through 19, we read, "And God said, 'Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth.' And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day." I think that greater and lesser light image from creation is a way we can look at Jesus saying, almost in the same breath, to let your light shine for all to see, and also don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, and when you pray, go into a room and close the door. It's the difference between shining the direct light of God when the source is clear in the day with the sun, and pulling back to be a reflected light in the shadows when someone might mistake our actions as being self-serving. There is a time to be a channel for the sun, and a time to reflect that light in more subtle and even hidden ways. 3 weeks ago, Sunday, January 12th, I was driving back to my cottage late in the afternoon. It was a clear sky, and I was headed due east with the full wolf moon rising in front of me. In my rearview mirror, because I was going due east, was the brilliant orb of the setting sun, by then halfway down the horizon. In that moment of seeing the full moon before me and the blazing sun bidding farewell in my rearview mirror, I felt a message from God, a message of assurance, but also of direction. And I spoke it aloud to myself in the car. We're driving into the night now. The sun is almost gone, and night is upon us. But even as I spoke those words, the moon was there before me, as if to say, "You do not go into the night alone, and you do not go without a light." Millions of living beings have learned to live and thrive with only the moon and stars to guide them. Learn from them. They are your companions and teachers in the dark. We are the light of the world. There is a time to shine like the sun so that people might be able to distinguish the light from the darkness and find help and healing. But there is also a time to reflect the sun's rays, creating perhaps only an outline in the shadows, or to shine as a distant star, a sign for those who seek it, shining into a future still light years away. But however expressed, light is what we are. God designed a world where all kinds of light are necessary to health and wholeness. Our light shouldn't always blaze, but we are always meant to shine. That is where my sermon ended last night. But I can't ignore the fact that our democracy fell over this past weekend. While no doubt our members voted for different people or perhaps didn't vote at all, I don't believe that any of you wrote in Elon Musk as a write-in for president. And yet he is now in full control. I can't even begin to explain the damage that has been done already, both to our system of government and to individuals just in the last week. But the destruction is so total and devastating that it will affect everyone in this room. So I feel an obligation as your pastor to read you yesterday's email, which I know some of you get from historian Heather Cox Richardson, who has for years now been chronicling what happens in the United States every single day. This is yesterday's issue, which doesn't even mention the trade war that began last night. She writes, throughout now President Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, it was clear that his support was coming from three very different factions whose only shared ideology was a determination to destroy the federal government. Now we are watching them do it. The group that serves President Donald Trump is gutting the government both to get revenge against those who tried to hold him accountable before the law and to make sure he and his cronies will never again have to worry about legality. Last night, officials in the Trump, so this was yesterday, so she's talking about Friday night. Last night, officials in the Trump administration purged the Federal Bureau of Investigation of all 6 of its top executives, and according to NBC's Ken Delanian, more than 20 heads of FBI field offices, including those in Washington, D.C. and Miami, where officials pursued cases against now President Trump. Acting Deputy Attorney General Emil Bove, who represented Trump in a number of his criminal cases, asked Acting FBI Director Brian J. Driscoll Jr. for a list of FBI agents who had worked on January 6 cases to, quote, determine whether any additional personnel actions are necessary, close quote. Clarissa Jan Lim of MSNBC reported that Trump denied knowing about the dismissals, but said the firings were a good thing because, quote, they were very corrupt people, very corrupt, and they hurt our country very badly with the weaponization, close quote. Officials also fired 25 to 30 federal prosecutors who had worked on cases involving the rioters who attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, and reassigned others. Bove ordered the firings. Career civil servants can't be fired without cause, and these purges come on top of the apparently illegal firing of 18 inspectors general across the federal agencies and a purge of the Department of Justice of those who had worked on cases involving Trump. Phil Williams of News Channel 5 in Nashville, Tennessee, reported on Friday that federal prosecutors were withdrawn from a criminal investigation of Representative Andy Ogles, a Republican from Tennessee, for election fraud. Ogles recently filed a House resolution to enable Trump to run for a 3rd term, and another supporting Trump's designs on Greenland. On Wednesday, federal prosecutors asked a judge to dismiss an election fraud case against former Representative Jeffrey Fortenberry, Republican from Nebraska. Trump called Fortenberry's case an illustration of, quote, the illegal weaponization of our justice system by the radical left Democrats, close quote. That impulse to protect Trump showed yesterday in what a local water manager said was a quote, extremely unprecedented release of water from 2 dams in California apparently to provide evidence of his social media post that the US military had gone into California and turned on the water. In fact, water was released from 2 reservoirs that hold water to supply farmland in the summer. They are about 500 miles, 800 kilometers from Los Angeles, where the fires were earlier this year, and the waters did not go to Southern California. Quote, "This is going to hurt farmers," a water manager said. "This takes water out of the summer irrigation portfolio." But Trump posted that if California officials had listened to him 6 years ago, there would have been no fires. Shashank Joshi of The Economist called it, quote, "real Mad King stuff." Trump's loyalists overlap with the MAGA crew that embraces Project 2025, a plan that mirrors the one used by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to overthrow democracy in Hungary. Operating from the position that modern democracy destroys a country by treating everyone equally before the law and welcoming immigrants, it calls for discrimination against women and gender, racial, and religious minorities, rejection of immigrants, and the imposition of religious laws to restore a white Christian patriarchy. Former Fox News Channel host Tucker Carlson has been a vocal proponent of Orban's ideology, and J.D. Vance this week hired Carlson's son, 28-year-old Buckley, as his deputy press secretary. Although Trump claimed during the campaign he didn't know anything about Project 2025, Steve Contorno and Casey Tolan of CNN estimate that more than 2/3 of Trump's executive orders mirror Project 2025. You can see the influence of this faction in the indiscriminate immigration sweeps the administration has launched. Trump's announcement that he is opening a 30,000-bed migrant detention center at Guantanamo Bay, and officials' revocation of protection for more than 600,000 Venezuelans legally in the US, and possibly also for Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. You can see it in the administration's attempt to end the birthright citizenship written into the US Constitution in 1868. It shows in the new administration's persecution of transgender Americans, including Trump's executive order purging trans service members from the military, another limiting access to gender-affirming care for transgender youth, and yet another ordering trans federal prisoners to be medically detransitioned and then moved to facilities that correspond to their sex at birth, an outcome that a trans woman suing the administration calls humiliating, terrifying, and dangerous. The administration has ordered that federal employees must remove all pronouns from their email signatures, and as Jeremy Faust reported in Inside Medicine, that researchers from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention must scrub from their work any references to gender, transgender, pregnant person, pregnant people, LGBT, transsexual, non-binary assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, biologically male, biologically female. Faust notes that the requirements are vague, and that because most manuscripts include demographic information about the populations or patients studied, the order potentially affects, quote, just about any major study, including studies on COVID-19, cancer, heart disease, or anything else. Those embracing this ideology are also isolationist. As soon as he took office, Trump imposed a freeze on foreign aid, except for military aid to Israel and Egypt, abruptly cutting off about $60 billion in funding, less than 1% of the U.S. budget, to the U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USAID, which provides humanitarian assistance to fight starvation and provide basic medical care for the globe's most vulnerable and desperate populations. The outcry, both from those appalled that the U.S. would renege on its promises to provide food for children in war-torn countries, and from those who recognize that the U.S. withdrawal from these popular programs would create a vacuum China is eager to fill, made Trump's new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say that humanitarian programs would be exempted from the freeze. But that appears to be either untrue or so complicated to negotiate that programs are shutting down anyway. Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, appears to be beside himself over this destruction. I quote, "Let me explain why the total destruction of U.S. aid matters so much," he posted on social media. China, where Musk makes his money, wants U.S. aid destroyed. So does Russia. Trump and Musk are doing the bidding of Beijing and Moscow. Why? "The U.S. is in full retreat from the world," he wrote, "and there is no good reason for it. The immediate consequences of this are cataclysmic. Malnourished babies who depend on U.S. aid will die. Anti-terrorism programs will shut down, and our most deadly enemies will get stronger. Diseases that threaten the U.S. will go unabated and reach our shores faster, and China will fill the void. As developing countries will now only be able to," I'm still continuing his quote, "as developing countries will now only be able to rely on China for help, they will cut more deals with Beijing to give them control of ports, critical mineral deposits, etc. U.S. power will shrink, U.S. jobs will be lost." Murphy speculated that, quote, "billionaires like Musk, who make money in China, or someone buying all that secret Trump meme coin, would benefit from deliberately sabotaging 80 years of U.S. goodwill on the international stage." Close quote from Chris Murphy. And that brings us to the third faction, that of the tech bros, led by billionaire Elon Musk, who, according to year-end Federal Election Commission filings, spent more than $290 million supporting Trump and the Republicans in 2024. Musk appears to consider colonizing space imperative for the survival of humanity, and part of that goal requires slashing government regulations, as well as receiving government contracts that help to fund his space program. Before he took office, Trump named Musk and another billionaire, Vivek Ramaswamy, to an extra governmental group called the Department of Government Efficiency, TOGE. But Musk has assumed full control of that group, whose mission is to cut the federal budget by as much as $2 trillion. Musk is interested in the government for future contracts, although a report from January 30th, when Musk's Tesla company filed its annual financial report, showed that the company, which is valued at more than $1 trillion and which made $2.3 billion in 2024, paid zero in federal income tax. Today, Musk's X social media, which used to be Twitter, became a form of state media when the National Transportation Safety Board said it would no longer email updates about this week's 2 plane crashes, one in Washington, D.C. and one in Philadelphia, and that reporters would have to get their information through X. Musk's goal might well be the crux of the drastic cuts to federal aid, as well as the attempt last week from the Office of Management and Budget to, quote, "pause federal funding and grants to make sure the funding reflected Trump's goals." After a public outcry over the loss of payments to local law enforcement, Meals on Wheels for shut-ins, supplemental nutrition programs, and so on, the OMB rescinded its first memo, but then White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt immediately contradicted the new memo, saying cuts were still in effect. The chaos surrounding the cuts could have been designed to make it difficult for opponents to sue over them. This method of changing government priorities through impoundment is illegal. Congress, which is the body that represents the American people, appropriates the money for programs, and the president takes an oath to execute the laws. After President Richard M. Nixon tried it, Congress passed a 1974 law making impoundment expressly illegal. But the on-again, off-again confusion appeared at first to stand a chance of stopping lawsuits. It didn't work. A federal judge halted the funding freeze, suggesting it was a blatant violation of the Constitution. But then yesterday, again, this is Friday, Elon Musk forced the resignation of David A. Lebrick, the highest-ranking career official at the Treasury Department. Lebrick had been at Treasury since 1989 and had risen to become the person in charge of the U.S. government payment system that disperses about $6 trillion a year through Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, contracts, grants, salaries for federal government workers, tax refunds, and so on, essentially managing the nation's checkbook. According to Jeff Stein, Isaac Arnsdorf, and Jacqueline Alemany of the Washington Post, Musk's team wanted access to the payment system. Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, demanded answers from Trump's new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, warning that, quote, "These payment systems simply cannot fail, and any politically motivated meddling in them risks severe damage to our country and the economy." He continues, "I am deeply concerned that following the federal grant and loan freeze earlier this week, these officials associated with Musk may have intended to access these payment systems to illegally withhold payments to any number of programs. I can think of no good reason why political operators who have demonstrated a blatant disregard for the law would need access to these sensitive, mission-critical systems." Now, though, with Musk's people at the computers that control the nation's payment system, they can simply stop whatever payments they want to. Wyden continued by reminding Bessent that the press had reported that Musk had previously been denied a high-level clearance to access the government's most sensitive secrets. "I am concerned," he wrote, "that Musk's enormous business operations in China, a country whose intelligence agencies have stolen vast amounts of sensitive data about Americans, including U.S. government employee data, by hacking U.S. government systems, endangers U.S. cybersecurity, and creates conflicts of interest that make his access to these systems a national security risk." This afternoon, Wyden posted that he had been told that Bessent had given the Department of Government Efficiency full access to the system. Social Security and Medicare benefits, grants, payments to government contractors, including those that compete directly with Musk's own companies, all of it. Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo posted, quote, "This is more or less like taking the gold from Fort Knox and putting it in Elon's basement. Anyone who gets a check from Social Security or anything else, he can cut it off or see all your personal and financial data." Pundit Stuart Stevens called it, quote, "the most significant data leak in cyber history." All three of these factions are focused on destroying the federal government, which, after all, represents the American people through their elected representatives and spends their taxpayer money. Musk, who is an unelected adjunct to Trump, this evening, this was Saturday evening, gleefully referred to the civil servants in the government who work for the American people as, quote, "the opposing team." But something jumps out from the chaos of the past 2 weeks. Instructions are vague, circumstances are chaotic, and it's unclear who is making decisions. That confusion makes it hard to enforce laws or sue, although observers note that what is going on in, quote, "illegal and a breach of the constitutional order," close quote. Our federal government rests on the U.S. Constitution. The three different factions of Trump's MAGA Republicans agree that the government must be destroyed, and they are operating outside the constitutional order, not eager to win legal victories so much as determined to slash and burn down the government without them. Today, senior Washington Post political reporter Aaron Blake noted that while it is traditional for cabinet nominees to pledge that they will refuse to honor illegal presidential orders, at least 7 of Trump's nominees have sidestepped that question. Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi, Director of National Intelligence nominee Tulsi Gabbard, now confirmed Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth, Small Business Administrator nominee Kelly Loeffler, Veterans Affairs Secretary nominee Douglas A. Collins and Commerce Secretary nominee Howard Lutnick all avoided the question by saying that Trump would never ask them to do anything illegal. FBI Director nominee Kash Patel just said he would always obey the law. And what she wrote, so that's the end, I know it's long, of Heather Cox Richardson's piece just from yesterday. As I mentioned, it didn't include the trade war that got kicked off last night, or Musk's aggressive and demeaning emails to over 2 million federal employees, because he's also taken over the Office of Personnel Management for the government, asking for their resignations. I'm sorry to have laid all of that on you, but we are going to find out very quickly what government agencies do as they cease to function. We are going to find out our reliance on immigrants and the benefits of the free trade agreements that are now defunct. The stock market will have it figured out by tomorrow morning. We have driven into the night. We, as a congregation, must learn to be guided by the moon and the stars. Hold each other close. Be kind. Be overly kind to every person that you meet. I walk into the post office up in New Hampshire. Older man held the door open for me, and I said, "Oh, thank you so very, very much." Kindness as much as we can. Budget carefully. Be there for one another. Let the small things go. Reflect the light of Christ in word and in deed. Amen.